Hello and welcome everyone, my name is Desi, and today I wanted to once again talk about one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, A Song of Ice and Fire. For this one I'm going to be talking about Book 2, A Clash of Kings, and I'm going to be following Arya Stark. So spoilers are incoming, so for those of you who haven't read Book 2, I would advise you to tune out or wait until you've read it. I'm going to be going kind of on a deep dive here. To start off, I want to point out that this is one of the most disturbing sequence of chapters in fantasy or any literature that I've ever read. I will say that the Red Wedding was pretty close to this, but this is more disturbing in its own way. And this focuses around Arya and her journey north with Yorn and the people he takes for the Night's Watch. We first join Arya at her father's execution, when everybody is anticipating that he will take the black, and Joffrey decides that he wants to mix things up and prove a point and be the stupid, spoiled little 12-year-old that he is, and execute Ned Stark to make a point. Or execute Ned Stark to 1, upset Sansa, and 2, to make a point. This, of course, is beyond stupid and is the main reason why Tywin sends Tyrion to come get things in order after this. So, Yorn essentially rescues Arya right as her father is getting executed. She basically would have came up and tried to stab one of them, probably Joffrey. I doubt she would have succeeded with Kingsguard around, so she would have just ended up getting caught. And as we know as book readers, and if you follow the show, if she would have gotten caught, that would have changed the entire course of events. It should be noted how much of a risk Yorn was taking by picking up Arya and taking her away. He is involving himself in matters outside of the Night's Watch. It also should be pointed out that if Yorn had not done this, as I mentioned earlier, the entire course of the books would have changed. So, a real solid for him to do that, and it just proves how much he respected Benjen Stark and the Starks in general, because they're really the only house that pays any attention to the wall, and Ned gave him a ton of troops, or gave him a ton of men to go north with, like 30 men. That's like almost 5% of the active force of, or the Night's Watch that Eddard sent north with Yorn. So Yorn is grateful. Yorn is a pretty solid dude, and we'll get to talk more about him. So I want to cover Arya's mental state right now. She is 9 years old. She has just killed a man in cold blood. Albeit, I think she did the right thing. But still, she straight up murked somebody with her sword, like shoved needle through him and watched him die. She just watched her father die. And basically all of her household guard has been killed. She almost gets caught. Her blade instructor, Syria Farrell, likely gets killed. So everyone around her is dying. And she just watched her father get executed, basically right in front of her. So she's not doing so hot mentally, and she's only 9 years old. So I just want to touch on that. And I know people say that Sansa went through a lot, and it's true she did, but Sansa hasn't seen half the stuff that Arya's seen at this point. And it's kind of amazing that Arya's still holding it together at this point, and not just completely breaking apart and breaking down. It just proves her mental fortitude, it proves her intelligence in a way, and it just proves how strong she is, and also like her training with Syrio Farrell has really helped her through this. This is one of Eddard's better moves, is realizing my daughter is a fighter just like her aunt was, so maybe I should teach her how to properly wield a sword, wield a blade, and fight. She might learn something from it, and this undoubtedly will save her on the road to come. So part 1, I'm going to just call the King's Road. This is where Yorn and the group managed to escape King's Landing, and everyone is starting to look for Arya at this point, but Yorn wisely cuts off her hair so she's unrecognizable. And there is a bit of tension because we know a war is broken out. And we know Yorn and his group are going north. Yorn, of course, doesn't know this. He doesn't know that Robb has called his banners. And he doesn't know that he's about ready to go into the Riverlands, which Tywin Lannister is basically ordering to be completely ravaged by his two most notorious captains, which we'll get to meet here in a little bit. So Jorn basically cuts her hair to where it's short and says, you're to identify as a boy, you're to make water in the woods and not let anybody know, because if they find out you're a girl, half of them will turn you over to the queen for a reward, and the other half will do bad things to you. That's all I'll say. Like, these chapters are already dark enough, we don't need to talk about SA. So, again, think about the mental state she's in, and now she has to worry about that. But right now, I think a deep dive really could be done into Arya's psychology, but that's not really my field of my expertise. I'm just talking about chapters that I think are extremely dark but extremely vivid. And although they are extremely depressing and sad and like scary at times, like you're actively worrying about this group you're growing more and more attached to. Like they're extremely well done. I don't think any fantasy author has done this. So Arya gets this new title, Lumpyhead, because of how poorly Jorn cut her hair, and she has her castle-forged sword needle with her, as well as a practice sword that she used with Syrio Forel. And one of the boys named Hot Pie and another named Lami Greenhands are both giving her crap because she's a lot smaller, and they think they can bully her. Well, that turns out to be a huge mistake, and Hot Pie tries to take Needle from her, and Arya essentially takes her wooden sword and just literally beats the crap out of him and knocks him on his butt, spins him around, and just beats him literally until he poops himself. And, of course, and I want to point out too, this is about the same time Jon is up on the wall, and he's basically in the practice yard, and he's just kicking everybody's butt because he's trained. And Arya is trained how to use a blade, and even though she's small and much younger than these boys who are in their, teenagers or whatever, she's naturally quick and agile, and she knows how to use this wooden stick of hers. So Hot Pie has no chance whatsoever, and he just basically gets spanked, and Lami makes the wise decision not to mess with her, so that ends the bullying right there. And Jorn punishes her for this because he needs to make an example. He can't just let her get away with literally beating the crap out of one of his wall recruits. So he basically spanks her 3 times with a wooden paddle, and she can't sit for 3 days. But he tells her, you can't be doing this to other boys. These are people that are going to be on the wall, and they're all going to be brothers. I can't have you doing this to them. And I just want to point out that Jorn is a very good man, despite his rough appearance. He is a homie. And although he spanked her or whatever, he had to make an example because he can't be having people beating each other up. They all need to get along. Especially considering the fact that they're on the King's Road and it's getting more and more treacherous. The first thing that really starts building the tension is the amount of people that are heading in the opposite direction. It is a steady and increasing wave of refugees. Soon many of them become armed refugees, and they start looking at Jorn's convoy with suspicion, and also maybe they want to rob him. It's becoming more and more lawless, and more people are going the other direction. They are obviously going into a war zone, and as the reader, you can pick up on the tension. So I really love the way that George does that. Each day, and how he describes it and how he writes this, you can clearly see that it's getting worse and worse, and eventually there starts to be graves on the side of the road. People are so desperate to get out of there that they're just basically taking everything with them, and people are starting to die. A merchant offers to buy their entire convoy, the horses and all the gear and the wagons for a quarter of what it's worth, basically saying, well, you're going to lose it anyway because you're going to get robbed. And Jorn is really starting to kind of question, well, maybe we shouldn't be going this way, but he's part of the Night's Watch, and the Night's Watch remains neutral. He has been taking this road for 30 years after all. Why does he need to worry? The Night's Watch takes no part. So they stop at an inn, and this is where we get to meet 3 people, the 3 really bad criminals, Biter, Jaqen, and Lorch. And Lorch is just this foul-mouthed, hairy, awful human being. Jaqen is this thin, handsome man. And Biter is this big, strong eunuch who has filed teeth. And Jaqen basically asks for some more ale as a refill, and Lorch is just constantly making threats and threatening to, like, do stuff with the stick that she's carrying. So, again, I want to point out Arya's mental state here. Instead of, like, walking away and, like, getting out of the situation, she walks up to the cage with these three criminals who even Yoren, who's a seasoned Night's Watch brother, has opted to chain and cage. And she almost gets grabbed by Biter, who is terrifying, and he probably would have killed her if he would have gotten his hands on her, but he doesn't quite get his hands on her, and she whacks him over the head with a stick. Like, she is, like, her mental state right now, she doesn't have the flight part of her brain activated. It's just fight, fight, fight. These are very dangerous men, especially Biter, and she can't be bothered. She just does not care. And eventually, the Bull, or as we know, Gendry, takes her away, and the Bull's a big, strong boy, son of Robert Baratheon. And he's like, "What are you doing, Arya?" Because she's playing as a boy, and Gendry is like, "What are you doing? Like, they scare me. You should be scared." But Arya's just so desensitized that she just doesn't care anymore. Like, she saw her dad die. Like, for all she knows, her family is in trouble, and she just wants to get back to Winterfell. So the next part is where we go into the war-torn land, the Riverlands. We're leaving the Crownlands, we're going to the Riverlands. This is a war zone. And again, this is why I'm doing this analysis, is because George actually gets into the nitty-gritty. Most fantasy and war novels don't talk about what actually happens in war, and what happens to the small folk, and what happens to innocent people, non-combatants, and what happens to the land. The land bleeds and the small folk bleed, while the lords and knights go playing their war games. So, before we get to the Scorched Earth part, Yoren does come across some corn, but is confronted by farmers and forced to pay. He's very upset about this, because normally the Night's Watch is allowed forage, and they're given the stuff for free because they're doing a service. Like, they're keeping the wildlings out, and the others, who obviously most people don't know about it anymore because of time. And a lot of people just think that people on the wall are keeping out, mythical creatures and stuff that doesn't exist. They don't really have a purpose anymore. And beyond this point, Yoren is really starting to get upset, because he's just like, nobody is showing us any respect. I've been taking this road for 30 years. It's never been this bad. And eventually, there's armed groups of small folk that start patrolling, and everyone's looking at Yoren's group suspiciously, even though they're Night's Watch. Like, everybody is on edge. And there's even a scene in the book where Arya says the world is holding its breath, or the night is holding its breath, like something's about to happen. And as the reader, again, the tension is ramped up even further. So the next day they come across a village that has been basically burnt to the ground, and I just want to read some quotes here. "The fields were a charred desolation for miles around. The houses were blackened shells. The carcasses of burnt and butchered animals dotted the ground under living blankets of carrion crows that rose, cawing furiously when disturbed. Arya saw burnt bodies impaled on sharpened stakes atop the walls, their hands drawn up tight in front of their faces as if to fight off the flames that had consumed them." Arya already is in a pretty bad mental state, and now she sees this village where there's just been completely destroyed and there's people on stakes. So it's pretty dark, very dystopian. They don't really talk about this in normal fantasy books. They might talk about the end of a battle, but they don't really talk about what actually happens to these towns that just get burnt. And like I said before, this is Lord Tywin's work because he sent his two dogs basically to cause as much damage as possible. Scorched Earth. So Yoren and some of the recruits go into the town, and they come back with an injured woman and a little girl. The little girl is only about 2 and just cries constantly, and we can assume that she's crying constantly because she just saw her entire family get murdered around her. It's said that she was actually able to probably talk at one time, but because the trauma had been so deep, like, she lost the ability. That she's that emotionally scarred. So we can only imagine what this little girl has seen. And the woman that they bring out is missing an arm. and she has eyes, quote unquote, that don't see anything. She has that 1,000-yard stare, and the only thing she says is please over and over again. We can only guess what happened to her. And then, unfortunately, she dies soon after, and she's buried under a willow tree, I believe. That night, Hot Pie admits that he is scared, and Arya and him start to bond a little bit. He starts, being nice to her, showing a little bit of respect, and they start, talking like normal people instead of being all antagonistic. Arya, of course, has to go pee, and she can't do it around anybody, so she wanders off in the woods and is confronted by a pack of wolves. But because of reasons, the wolves do not attack her and wander off. In the next day or two, they find an abandoned holdfast and shack up. They are no longer able to take the road because they are blocked, and it's just getting more and more treacherous, especially with all the burned towns and villages. And Jorn is really starting to question whether he should have got a boat and should have just sailed to the Night's Watch, or East Watch by the Sea, I believe is what it's called. But he's never had an issue on the King's Road in 30 years. But this war is not like the other wars that he's seen. And that night, even though they are holed up, there is a raid that happens, and a group of riders and soldiers basically put the town to the torch. The town is abandoned when they entered it, and this is why Jorn is like, okay, we need to get inside these walls. There's actually a holdfast and a set of walls around it. Not a very big fort, but enough to house them and keep them somewhat protected. But this is a large host of men who enter the town and put it to the torch. So there are riders that challenge them and assume that Jorn and his group are part of what's called the Brotherhood. And although Jorn is like, we're part of the Night's Watch, we have no part in these wars. Who commands here? This high-pitched pig of a man called Sir Amory Lorch addresses them, and he says, basically, if you're not rebels, let us come in and make sure. And Jorn is not an idiot, and he's like, no. You can clearly see we're part of the Night's Watch. Look at my cloak and everything else. We take no part in these wars. But Sir Amory doesn't care, because Sir Amory is a dim-witted fool and a brute. And he basically says, quote unquote, I command you once more in King Joffrey's name to prove the loyalty you profess and open these gates. And Jorn says, don't think I will. And Amory says, so be it. You defy the king's command and so proclaim yourself rebels, black cloaks or no. And Jorn is like, got me young boys in here. And Amory, of course, doesn't care. Says, young boys and old men die the same. Storm the walls and kill them all. And thus begins a particularly sharp but brutal battle. The battle starts with Sir Amory's men trying to get over the walls. The Night's Watch hold them off fairly well initially, but they are overrun. And a fierce melee ensues as the troops of Sir Amory enter the holdfast and start cutting people down. Surprisingly for being recruits and petty thieves, the Night's Watch men do hold off fairly well, but this is not a heroic last stand. Some of them yield and get cut down. Gendry, Hot Pie, and Lamy are all together fighting. And just some quotes. Dauber wrestled the man off the wall, and Lamy smashed his head with a rock before he could rise, and hooted until he saw the knife in Dauber's belly and realized he would not be getting up either. Arya had jumped over a dead body no older than Jon, lying with his arm cut off. She didn't think she'd done it, but she wasn't sure. Everything smelt of blood, and smoke, and iron, and piss. The night rang to the clash of steel and the cries of wounded and dying. Death was all around her. Gendry and Arya corner this guy who gets over the walls. The skinny guy basically double team him. Gendry knocks off his helm and breaks his sword on it. And so the helm gets knocked off, and Arya sees that underneath he was bald and scared looking with missing teeth and a speckled gray beard. But even as she was feeling sorry for him, she was killing him. This could have been like some grandfather, whatever, who was levied. And this is such a juxtaposition, because Arya, as you learn as you go further on, and in the past, Arya is a good person. She has a moral compass. But here she is murdering this poor man who was probably just levied. But thus is the way of war. Kill or be killed. And she knows that. Again, she doesn't know how not to fight at this point. She has no flight. She just has fight. And this is a very smelly, nasty battle, and they become overrun. Yoren comes up to Arya and says, "You guys need to get out of here. We've lost. Take the children, take the girl, and get out of here." So Ari, Gendry, Hot Pie, and Lami and the little girl escape through a tunnel. Lami, unfortunately, is wounded, but they all manage to escape. And thus, we enter the third part of the story. So, the next morning, the town is a complete ruin. If it could burn, the Lannisters had burned it, and if they could die, they had killed it. Again, this is a Scorched Earth campaign. We already know the nature of Sir Amory. This is the first time we meet him, although we have heard bits and pieces about him. Now we know he is a cold-blooded murderer, and also kind of an idiot at the same. Actually, not kind of an idiot, he is an idiot. Tywin only uses him because people fear him, and he has basically an unquenched bloodlust. So they go into the town, because Arya wants to make sure, or wants to see if Yoren possibly survived. So they do find Yoren, and we learn that Yoren was a pretty good fighter throughout the battle, but unfortunately the numbers were just too many. The axe blow that had killed him had split his skull apart, with the corpses of 4 men-at-arms heaped near Yoren. He was going to take me home, she thought, as they dug the old man's hole. So they bury Yoren, and at this point, their entire group has pretty much been killed. Fortunately, the holdfast had a contraption where I think there was a gate or a ladder that if you pull it up, that it cannot be breached unless it's starved out. Sir Amory didn't have the patience to starve out the few men that were left in the holdfast, so he just left. But Yoren is gone, and it's not looking good for the group of children. Although they do manage to find, I think, 3 men that were in the holdfast that survived the night, because the Lannisters couldn't get to him. So after this, it becomes very dire when the 2 men, or actually 3 men to start out. One of them was a poacher, which would have been pretty nice, but he had a wound which festered and he perished from it. And the 2 other men, because Lami is injured, don't really want to stick around with 2 kids, with a bunch of kids and an injured kid, so they abandon them, which makes sense. And it's not a good thing what they did, but Arya is smart enough to understand why they did it, but she says she can't not hate them for doing it, and they're forced to survive off of grubs and bugs and worms, and they're growing hungry and in dire straits. They don't really have anything for hunting, none of them are trained to hunt or do anything else like that. So they don't have any bows or anything like that. They're not equipped to hunt animals or hunt game. Gendry is the oldest one, I think, and he's 15. So the next couple of days, they see a camp up ahead, and by this point, Lami's wound is getting pretty bad. They're carrying him, and Lami just wants to yield. They're all hungry, and they see this camp, and they're like, okay, well, if we just go, Lami and Hot Pie, if we just go and yield to them, they'll let us eat. And Arya and Gendry, being smarter, Gendry being older, are like, that's not going to work. You guys aren't knights. They're not going to yield. They're not going to be able to ransom you. You're worthless to them. You're just another mouth to feed. So Gendry and Arya are now the de facto leaders. And I want to point something out, because I wrote this down. If anybody's watched Lord of the Flies, this really kind of gave me those vibes, except it's the opposite. In Lord of the Flies, the adults come to save the children, where in this, the adults abandon the children. And it's becoming more and more dire straits. And of course, you have a child who is dying from a wound. Like, this is not a good situation. So after that, Arya and Gendry agree to approach the camp and try to sneak some food away. But before they can get there, Gendry stops and says, I think Lami is going to die. And Arya knows this, but again, she just, despite all that she's been through, she has this moral compass. And it's pretty amazing how she's able to maintain that. And we haven't even got to the worst of it yet. So in terms of what's going on with Arya, she thinks whenever it was her turn to carry him, she could feel how warm his skin was and the stink of his leg. She knows he's dying. Gendry wants to leave him and says he's going to die, and the sooner he does it, the better for the rest of us. Gendry's being a realist here. And this is interesting to me, and this is why I wrote these quotes down. Gendry's a good person, he's proven so. Even though he's the biggest and the strongest, he kind of acts like a protector. But even he at this point is like, Lami's gonna die. He's got a wound, we don't have the food. And Arya even says, well, let's get a maester. And Gendry's like, no, a maester's not going to take care of him. Why would he? He's not worth anything. He's just a peasant. He's a thief. He's going to the wall. The only place people that would have taken care of him are gone. And eventually Gendry brings up the fact that Arya's a girl. And he can tell that she's a girl because she goes to make water in the woods. Arya, of course, vehemently denies this, but eventually admits it since Gendry isn't budging. And tells him that she's Arya Stark of Winterfell, and we get this brief moment of levity in this dark chapter of where he gets all embarrassed. I love Gendry's character, by the way, but he gets super embarrassed because he was peeing in front of her and stuff and talking about, like, dick jokes and stuff like that, and he actually calls her milady and begs pardon from her, and it pisses her off so much that she kicks him, which makes him go into like a laughing fit, and it's pretty funny. But things take a very dark twist after that, and this is part 4, A Pack of Rabid Dogs. These next 2 chapters are really dark and really heavy. So the first thing Arya sees as she approaches this camp is this line of corpses on a gibbet. Corpses all, so savaged and decayed that it took a moment to realize they had all been stripped before they were hanged. They did not look like people at all. So obviously Arya is a little bit wary, since there is a bunch of bodies hanging outside of this camp. She makes the right assessment that it is a Lannister group, but she doesn't quite see what the Bannisters are, because she had experience with Sir Amory, and she assumed based on the brutality that she had seen previously that this is another subgroup of them. She sees these people on the gibbet. Again, at someone at 9 years old, if I would have seen this at 9 years old, it would have been pretty hard on my psyche. But by this point, Arya is more and more calloused and hardened to this sort of thing. She just went through a battle where a bunch of people got slaughtered in front of her. She's, by now, killed a handful of people with her sword. But she does make the assessment that dead men could not hurt her, but whoever had killed them could. So she does some more observation and scouting, but she hears shouts, and to her dismay, Gendry has been captured. So this camp is next to a lake. So as she's waiting, a breeze from the lake comes. The camp is next to a lake, and the banner stirred and lifted. The one on the tall staff bore the golden lion as she had feared. The one on the other, 3 sleek black shapes ran across a field yellow as butter. Dogs, she thought. And as we know, this is House Clegane, and she eventually grasped that it's the mountain. She was at the King's tourney, so that's how she knows. So Arya stays for a while and waits for night so she can sneak away. She goes back and gets Hot Pie to agree to help, but he's terrified, and unfortunately he loses his nerve when he makes a noise because he's not very good at sneaking, and the guards call out. He immediately yields. Arya, of course, goes into her fight mode and tries to stab somebody, but they're all mailed. So it basically just glances off. She gets disarmed and then smacked with a mailed fist. The Mountain himself, who is this giant of a man, comes out and orders them to lead them to the others. You can basically assume Gregor Clegane is another dumb brute, and he just assumes that even though these are children, they're part of the Brotherhood, because everybody is part of the Brotherhood in his mind, because he drinks too much milk of the poppy and his brain doesn't work right. So as they go back to the camp, the Clegane men-at-arms go with them. Lami, of course, yields as soon as he hears them. And for those of you who watch the show, knows what happens. A gentleman by the name of Raff the Sweetling, who is carrying a spear, is looking around, and he looks over at Lami and says, "Something wrong with your leg, boy?" And Lami's like, "Yeah, I heard it. You gotta carry me." And Raff walks over to him and says, "Think so." And before Lami can yield or do anything, Raff simply takes the spear and shoves it through his neck and kills him. Now, this is a very bad, unethical thing to do, of course, but I want you to think about the conversation that Gendry and Arya had earlier. Lami is dying, and I'm not going to the defense of Raff the Sweetling, because Raff the Sweetling is terrible, and he murders somebody later on. But he almost does Lami a mercy by giving him a swift, clean death here at this point. It is disturbing, it is nasty, and he deserves to die for it, but Lami is going to die anyway. That's kind of an aside, but yeah, this is just more emphasis to prove that the Clegane group are a bunch of brutes and thugs and murderers. So chapter 26. This is still hard for me to read. They are captured, they are put in a storehouse essentially with a bunch of other prisoners, and every day one of them is dragged out for questioning by a man called the Tickler, who is this gentleman in the middle, very nondescript sort of man, and he essentially tortures them by removing bits of flesh or whatever. And even if they are innocent, he kills them anyway. And this really does a number on Arya, and she tries to be bold, and she tries not to be afraid, but as some of these quotes say, she had thought what she had known to be, but as some of George's quotes say, some of the quotes from this chapter really show how bad it was for her psychologically. She had thought she had known what it meant to be afraid, but she had learned better in that storehouse besides the God's Eye. 8 days she had lingered there, and every day she had seen someone die. A young mother with a pock-scarred face offered freely to tell them all she knew if they'd promised not to hurt her daughter. The mountain heard her out, and then he picked her daughter to make sure she had held nothing back. No one ever survived the Tickler's questioning. No man, no woman, no child. So even though these people are innocent and are just small folk and probably know nothing, this group of dogs doesn't care. They are just murdering for the fun of it. We do meet another group like this in the future, but it doesn't have the same level of detail of the Tickler just like pulling people apart and killing them. So there is a little boy in there, and the boy of 3 would not stop calling for his father, so they smashed his face in with a spiked mace. His mother, of course, seeing her child murdered in front of her, wasn't very pleased about it, and so they killed her too. And that was our good friend, Wrath the Sweetling, who has now murked 2 innocent people. You can imagine that Arya, a 9-year-old, mind you, want to bring that up again, is absolutely terrified because she doesn't know if she's going to get picked next. They don't kill Gendry right away because he is a blacksmith and he's too valuable to kill. So that's actually, the show kind of mentions that. But every, basically, man who was soldier age was just killed on the spot as soon as they were captured. Just for the fun of it. Like, this is a group of murderous villains. Painted brigands. Eventually, they are marched to Harrenhal, and Sir Gregor, the Mountain, gives them a rather uninspiring speech about how they're all worthless and useless and they should be dead, but Lord Tywin has shown mercy and wants to spare them. If they cannot keep up on the long forced march, they are killed outright. If any try to escape, they are killed outright. And of course, the women, being war, are taken advantage of, taken into the bushes. One of them that's prettier than the others is taken multiple times until she's had enough and smashes one in the head with a rock. So after she does this, Sir Gregor made everyone watch as he took off her head with a massive sweep of his massive 2-handed greatsword. A frothing dog. That's one of the descriptions of Sir Gregor. And I think it's an apt description. Like, this is one of the most vile group of men in literature. That cannot be understated. So during this march to Harrenhal, this is when Arya makes her list. Arya, of course, prides herself on being bold and brave, but there are people that are bold and brave, and the Tickler makes them die screaming. What the Tickler did really, really messed with her, which is understandable. This is a 9-year-old watching people getting pulled apart in front of her and screaming as they're dying. But anyways, this is this is already depressing enough, and beyond this point, once they get to Harrenhal, the story obviously turns, the arc turns, and people say that Sansa went through a lot. And yes, Sansa did. I understand why Sansa did what she did, being an 11-year-old girl and having these dreams, and being rather idealistic. Arya's more of a realist. But Arya had it way worse than Sansa, everyone. Undeniable. Joffrey is a saint compared to this group of men on screen, and compared to the Mountain and Sir Amory Lorch. And it's no wonder beyond this point where Arya becomes more cold and detached and more willing to spill blood. She is psychologically devastated. And it's amazing that she's keeping it together. I know I've said this 20 million times, but this is a 9-year-old going through hell. And props to George for the writing. Like, some of this stuff I feel like was a bit too much, especially in chapter 26 with Clegane's men. But this is war. This is not painted with a pretty color or a pretty coat. This is raw, crude, real war. And this is what happens to the small folk during war. So, props to George for that. I hope you all, I don't know if enjoyed is the right term, but I hope you've all found this interesting. These are some of the most impactful chapters I've ever read in literature. And let me know what you think in the comments. Peace.